SEP Fanfic Readings presents Measure of a Man by Inna Days 22. Chapter 4. Theory of Incompatibility. March 25th, 2011. Hermione had always been fascinated by the stars. Sometimes, on nights that were clear and unseasonably warm, she would wait until everything was quiet and take a blanket out into the pasture behind her house to lay out and gaze up at the sky. It made Hermione feel small, overlooked, but she liked that. Every pain and anxiety she carried from war and recovery, the worries that fluttered in and out of her mind every now and then, everything that culminated and threatened to consume her, it all seemed less overwhelming whenever she inhaled, exhaled, and understood that she was just one person in the middle of something much larger than herself. The universe. And Hermione knew her place in it. She was vital to few, important to some, a face in the crowd to others, and a stranger to most. Overall insignificant in the greater cycle of nature. There to serve her purpose, to just live life the best way she knew how. During those brief, tranquil moments, while in contact with the earth and dwarfed by the heavens above, she felt held, content, and at peace. Free. Insignificance, she'd realized during therapy, wasn't demeaning, simply a reminder that she didn't have to be anything and everything at all moments. Only herself for that moment. And because of her understanding, it was as if the entire universe had unlocked itself, stretching out before her, filling her up with the notion that anything was possible. Tonight she didn't wait for very long after girls' night concluded before she made her way outside with her blanket. Still warm from the wine Pansy had insisted they drink, so they wouldn't crash like they had the week before. Hermione laid out in the grass and observed the sky. The night was clear, with just enough thin clouds to partially obscure the waning gibbous moon, allowing her to properly observe the sky that was dotted with stars. Some were large, others little more than a speck to her naked eye, but it was all stunning. The sound of peaceful wildlife and chirping bugs was calming. Peaceful. Hermione spotted the Big Dipper first, tilting rightward on its handle, then followed it towards the Polaris, then back up and over where she landed on the ever-present Draco, who weaved its way between both dippers. From tip to head, Hermione used her finger to draw the dragon's body in the sky. She was moving towards Eltonine when the hum of her wards drew her attention. Nothing alarming, just Harry and Ron. A surprise, but not an unwelcome one. Hermione turned her head to watch them approach, identifying them less because of their magical signatures, and more by the way they walked. Even in the grass, Ron walked too loudly, while Harry moved with the stealth of a cat due to years of being both an Auror and a parent. He was also more identifiable because he'd come bearing another blanket, one that looked to have come from her sofa. Thoughtful. She never accounted for how cool it would get while she was out here. Harry took to unfolding the blanket while Ron plopped down next to her after greeting her with a boyish smile. The moonlight made it possible for her to see the color in his eyes and the flush of his cheeks.
"Hey."
"Hey," Hermione returned as he settled next to her. "You smell like a pub."
Ron laughed like he always did when he was pissed. "Seamus was in town, and we had to take advantage of Harry's free night. We met up at the Leaky, but ended up across a bar closer to Dean's house. He didn't want to be too far away from Daphne."
"She's not due until June."
Ron only shrugged in response. He had no practical experience with babies outside his nieces and nephews.
Harry fanned out the blanket and covered them both.
"She wasn't feeling well."
"Ah, she'd have to pay her a visit and bring her the teas she'd made just for her." Pretty soon she was wedged between her first friends, all huddled together under the same blanket. Warm, content, it felt like home. It felt like family. That feeling never changed. Harry was looking up at the sky with his hands behind his head. Hermione knew he had no idea what he was looking at because he'd never bothered to remember what they'd learned in astronomy. Ron was in a similar position, with one hand tucked behind his head and the other mere centimeters from hers, equally as unaware. She moved her hand away, placing it on her stomach. They laid in perfect silence for so long that Ron dozed off, his head right at her shoulder, his breath on her arm. It was only when he let out a light snore that Harry said, "I didn't want you to find out about Narcissa Malfoy like that." It was the last thing she'd expected him to say. "You don't have to tell me everything." He lifted up and used one hand to scrub his face.
"Yeah, I know, But still, I didn't tell you because I wasn't sure how I felt about it myself. It wasn't bad. She's... After struggling to find the words, he settled on, interesting. It was a reflex that made her snort in disagreement, but Harry laughed all the same. The witch she'd met could be described as far more than merely interesting. Complicated seemed more like it. Also, shrewd, overbearing, and proud. Still, she understood why Theo had recommended her over Susan. I learned a fairly significant amount of useless information, mostly about wizarding etiquette, but she wasn't mean. Harry shrugged. Malfoy reminds me of her when he's glaring or questioning someone's status as being capable of higher thought. So, basically all the time. Harry shook his head in amusement. Oh, and she asked me why I named all my children after dead people, so that was fun. There was a moment's pause before they both started laughing. Even based on Hermione's limited knowledge of her as a person, that sounded very much like something Narcissa Malfoy would ask. What did you say in response? I asked her why everyone in the Black family was named after constellations. She looked at me as if I was a special sort of idiot before she said, tradition. Then she gave me a look that said, your move, and I just shut up after that. Hermione couldn't hold back her laughter. She's sharp, that's for sure. Which made her inevitable decline all the more tragic and sobering, humbling. Everything she'd created, built, and overcome would soon forget. Hermione couldn't imagine losing her memories. They were a piece of who she was, the good and the bad. Her connection between the past and the present, which would pave the way for the future. Losing all of that was a fate no one deserved. One worse than death. In one breath, Hermione confessed a thought that had been weighing on her since her meeting with Narcissa. She knew I was going to turn her down before I said anything. At that, Harry's eyes found hers. She could barely see the flecks of green in the darkness, just his signature confused expression. Why did you turn her down? I won't act like I understand your job, because I don't, but I've never seen you decline anyone. I don't work with people I know. Ron snuffled in his sleep. His hair tickled her jawline. Do you really know her? Harry asked. Outside of that day, you've got little idea of who she is or who she's become since the war. I confess I still don't know, but as a parent, I understand her reasons for wanting to be accepted into your care. If I had to, I'd ask Malfoy for help if it meant more time with my kids. Hermione highly doubted that, no matter how serious he sounded. Besides, you worked with Molly after her poisoning. That's different, Hermione argued gently, unable to raise her voice at him in any way. They'd been through too much for that. Narcissa is going to need years of care to fight a battle she's never going to win. Who better to have on her side than you? She stared at her best friend for a long time, repeating his question in her head over and over, without being able to formulate a response. Ron had moved, mumbling inaudible words under his breath as he shifted closer to her. Harry's brows went up. On to a different topic of conversation. What are you going to do about that? He nodded in Ron's direction. When she gave him a long look, he feigned an innocent expression. I'm not getting involved. Just asking a question. With a sigh, Hermione rolled her eyes. What's there to do? We broke up. Years ago. Messily, as I'm sure you remember. The look on his face clearly told her to stop kidding herself. He'd never put himself in the middle of their drama, not even while they were dating. He'd always played the role of the mediator. When it got too bad, he just hid from the both of them until whatever fight had been resolved. Better than choosing a side. You know what I mean, Hermione, Harry frowned. He thinks... I'm aware of what he thinks, but he's wrong. Then maybe you should start dating. He ran a hand through his dark hair, messing it up beyond repair. Clearly he wanted to have the conversation less than she did, but that didn't stop him from talking about it. As long as you're single, he'll always think he has a chance. He'll never let up. He's stubborn like that. Like you. She cut him down with another glare that seemed to roll off him like water. Hear me out. If you're not so available, I don't want to date someone just to make a point. You know that's not who I am. I'm not saying that. Harry kept his voice low, his words slow and measured. I'm saying bring someone around and show Ron that you aren't an option. Me simply saying I'm not an option should be enough. Harry scratched his hairline. I know, I do. Then why bring it up at all? Why not encourage him to move on? I have been, but he's insistent this time. If you're unavailable, he'll get the message, and I won't have to listen to his plans for getting you back knowing full well they won't work." Hermione sighed. She knew how much of a strain their failure to launch had put on him. "I'll think about it. That's all I ask." Harry knew her well enough to know that she hardly ever made impulse decisions. Breaking up with Ron hadn't even been one. Quitting the ministry, healing, nothing was done rashly, only after deep thought and consideration at all points. Shifting a bit on the blanket, he turned his body towards her, opened his mouth, and paused thoughtfully. "I know you'll tell everyone who will listen how happy you are as you are, but I also know you, Hermione. I know you're stagnant because you're looking for something you haven't found yet." She stared at her closest friend, but didn't argue. In the quiet around them, Hermione could admit that he wasn't wrong. Her heart was thudding in her chest when she asked, "What do you think I'm looking for?" "What most people look for. Something deeper, something with greater meaning, connection, emotion, something real. I hope you find it. I know I don't say it as much as I should, but I do appreciate everything you do. We all do. You give a lot, not just to your patients, but to us as well. Especially with Albus. Sometimes I worry that it's too much." Hermione shoved him lightly. "Are you getting maudlin on me, Harry?" "No," he rolled his eyes, "but it would be nice for you to get something back in return." She bit her lip. "I do get fulfillment from helping everyone. I'm content, and I know my limits." She saw his expression turn serious in the near darkness, which made her stop. A light breeze danced in the trees. "Everything I do is because I want to. You know that, right? I don't do it to get something back." "And that makes you deserve whatever it is you want even more."
March 28th, 2011. No one was more surprised than Molly when Hermione turned up at the Burrow bright and early on Monday morning with a wicker basket full of fresh cauliflower, leeks, chicory, and onions. She'd also brought along a container of fresh eggs from her small chicken coop. It wasn't much, but they didn't need to keep much around anymore, at least not until the first Sunday of each month when all the Weasleys, family and friends, and their significant others, and any children not away at Hogwarts gathered for family dinner. Appreciative as always, Molly asked her to stay for a while and had a cup of tea ready before she could decline. That was her way. Nurturing, albeit a bit pushy. But her heart was always in the right place. "How are you feeling, dear?" Mrs. Weasley wore that motherly smile that made her grin as well. Molly reached over and tucked her hair behind her ear. "You're not working too hard, are you?" "I'm doing well. Not working too hard, I promise." Hermione sipped her tea, noting the slice of lemon in the Earl Grey, and Molly had gotten the sugar just right. For a brief moment, she thought about how strange it was that the line of questioning that had driven her to irritation with her own mother sounded so different coming from Molly. "I've just gotten my last assignment swapped over to the primary healer for maintenance. He's doing quite well. It's remarkable." "That's exciting, dear. I saw his wife in Diagon Alley, and she couldn't stop singing your praises. I'm so happy for their family to be whole again." Her smile was genuine, if a little sad like it always was when she thought about Fred. It wasn't much, but it was all Molly could muster. Grief never arrived or left on a particular schedule, so Hermione readied herself by scooting her chair closer and resting her head on Molly's shoulder. For several quiet minutes, they stayed like that until the older woman affectionately squeezed her arm. "Thank you." Hermione lifted her head and nodded. "Any time." Mrs. Weasley smiled softly at her. "You do look rested." "I slept well last night." She, Harry, and Ron had spent the evening watching movies at Harry's house. It was his last night before Ginny and the kids returned from Shell Cottage, but he had had to work, so they weren't up too late. Ron had the next day off and had seen her home. "Good. Now drink up before it gets cold." Hermione scooted back, obediently taking another sip of her hot tea. "I'm glad that you're resting between assignments. I'm proud of you, but you really do tend to overextend while you're working. Don't forget to make time for yourself." "I won't." Again. The unspoken implication hung in the air between the two women. More than any awkwardness between Harry, Hermione had worried most about what Molly would think when she broke things off with Ron. By then, she had become more than just a mother figure. She was someone she trusted, confided in. Of course, Hermione had never agreed with her more traditional views, but she'd never met a belief she didn't challenge. They could disagree, and she would still love her. Simple as that. Over the years, Molly had given her example after example of how blood didn't always make a family. She was supportive when Hermione returned from Australia with only her parents' forgiveness and their phone number, holding her long after she'd cried herself to sleep. And she'd continued that support through her breakup with Ron. Molly had even been there when she'd woken up in St. Mungo's, fragile and lost. She'd seen her through recovery and therapy, Healer Academy, and beyond. Never wavering, sometimes lecturing, but always loving her. And, unexpectedly, Hermione had returned the good deed 2 years ago when Molly had come into contact with a letter that had been smeared with poison and delivered to the burrow. She'd taken over her care, brewing the antidote with time to spare, and no lasting effects. It was after that incident when Hermione figured out the spell that made them all unplottable. Have you and Neville started planning the next planting season? If you haven't, let me know when. I'd love to come over and help. Oh, you don't. We can. I insist, Molly said with a smile. The wars, losing my brothers, Fred, and everyone else. It made me realize just how precious time is. Being poisoned reminded me of that as well. It's simple things like planting fruits and vegetables with the little ones that make me appreciate the time I have with them more. It's priceless. They don't stay like that forever, you know, but the memories I make with them will outlive me. Strangely, the statement stuck with her, made Hermione revisit her argument with Pansy and her discussion with Harry about Narcissa. She thought about what she knew, what she didn't, and what she had learned along the way. Time was something that Narcissa Malfoy needed and was poised to pay any price for, but she would never be able to purchase enough, no matter the sum. It must have been incredibly difficult for her to swallow her pride and ask for Hermione's help when there was something she had given Molly for free. What's troubling you, love? Hermione forced a smile and almost diverted to another topic, almost made excuses for whatever clues she had carelessly dropped, but she couldn't. It was a real possibility that the topic would be one that kept coming up, especially with Pansy's vehement opposition of her refusal to accept Narcissa as a patient. She needed someone objective, someone without a card to play in the matter. I had a consultation with a patient. Hermione carefully considered her words. She has a disease that we can possibly slow the progression of with long-term aggressive care, but I declined the case. Oh dear, why? Theo suggested her, knowing that she was against my rules. I'm sure he had his reasons. He did, Hermione sighed, still mulling it over a bit. There was one thing about the situation that didn't make sense. Theo's role, his game, the reason for his involvement. She simply couldn't accept the fact that she was the mother of someone Theo considered part of his family. I don't know what his motivations are, but she requested the best healer, and he thinks I'm it. Molly smiled proudly. From what I've heard of your work and seen of it myself, I'd have to agree. I was supposed to take a lot longer to heal from the poison, but you had me back home in a week with your quality care. Lowering her head in quiet modesty, Hermione tucked her hair behind her ear and acknowledged her words with a nod. Her disease is not so uncommon in muggles, but it is rare in wizards, and aggressive. So aggressive, in fact, that not much is known about it. I can't even guarantee that I'll be able to provide the care she needs, or the time she wants. It's outside my purview. I'm confident that you'll read and research to figure out, even if you can give her the proper care. Hermione tilted her head to the side, face twisted in confusion. You make it sound like I'm going to take the case. Aren't you? Molly met her with a challenging look. If it were me or Arthur or anyone you care about, would you do it? I wouldn't hesitate. Well, that's against your rules. Why is this person any different? Hermione chuckled, thinking back on the way she and Narcissa had glared at each other in her office last week. The difference had been that there were more than a matter of social class and individual temperament. It went down to their core values and blood. Plenty of reasons. If the circumstances were reversed, she wouldn't spare me a second thought. I've never seen you turn down someone in need, not even when you don't like them or vice versa. I've seen you accept patients that don't respect you until after they've been in your care. It's never mattered to you. They are your patient, and you remain objective no matter what. You treat them no matter what. In response to Molly's argument, she had no words. I can't tell you what to do, love. In the end, it's your decision, and I'll support whatever you decide, but give it some thought. She pondered for several moments that seemed eternal, but in the end she nodded. "I will." "Good," Molly smiled and returned to her previous conversation. "Now, when is Neville coming?" "Saturday morning. Harry's taking Lily for a daughter date, so Ginny will come over with the boys to help clear the spot in the vegetable patch. All the seedlings are ready. Neville brought over the pots for the ambergreens, celery, and broccoli. I'll let them each pick a fruit or vegetable that they want to plant in the greenhouse. Any preferences?" "Cucumbers, definitely. Last year's were so crisp and lovely." Hermione nodded. She already had some ready to be planted. "What did the kids pick?" "Al wants watermelon, which is a tall order, so we'll see. James wants grapes, but I definitely have to grow them in the greenhouse with the fruit trees. Lily will eat anything off a bush. I've pruned the blueberry bush, and it's looking to be a great year for them. She'll like that. Ginny agrees with James about grapes, so I can make wine." They both fondly rolled their eyes. "Regardless, it'll be fun." "And what do you want?" Hermione shrugged with a soft smile. "A healthy vegetable patch." "You've got to want more than that, love." She shook her head. "Healthy crops will suffice." "If you say so." Molly was quiet for a moment, and Hermione thought the older witch would make another go at trying to make her confess to wanting more. But then she asked, "Did Ron make any suggestions?" Ah, there it was, Hermione's only problem, and a similar complaint she had with her own mother, was the fact that Molly was still determined for her to become her daughter, in one way or another. "He's invited himself to help this weekend." Molly couldn't hide her elation. "Such a good man my son is. Always willing to help those he cares about." She gave her a meaningful look that Hermione ignored by drinking her tea. "He's even upstairs right now taking care of the ghoul who woke up Arthur and I this morning by banging on the pipes. He should be down soon." Almost on cue, her youngest son strolled into the kitchen, sweeping his hair from his face. He was dressed in dark jeans, trainers, and the Arsenal jersey her dad had given him ages ago for Christmas. "I've finished," he noticed Hermione just as she finished her last of her tea. "Hey, what are you doing here?" She placed her teacup on the table, but Molly answered before she could speak. "She brought over some eggs and vegetables. Be sure to bring her a gift for good luck when we plant this weekend." Hermione's eyes narrowed at the pointed look she gave her son. She had never heard of such a tradition. Molly slowly rose to her feet, lovingly patted her on the shoulder. "You two chat. I'll put up the vegetables." Hermione went to get up. "I can—" Mrs. Weasley shooed her and picked up the wicker basket. No, I can handle this. I'll be back soon." Ron watched his mother leave the room, but before he could take a seat, Hermione stood up, ready to leave. She could always come back later for the basket. Unfortunately, the action put her directly in front of Ron, who wore a look of determination she was all too familiar with. "What are you doing the rest of the day?" The question tumbled out in a rush, but the impatient sigh she involuntarily gave off. He cringed a little and ran a nervous hand through his unruly hair. "It's been a while since we've hung out. Just the two of us." That was intentional. The last time they'd been alone together, Hermione had made a few regrettable decisions out of a bizarre culmination of weakness, loneliness, and a habit of doing stupid things to avoid the bigger issue. She learned old habits died harder than she cared to admit. She really had known better. If falling into bed with Ron was as problematic as it was destructive, sex wasn't the issue. Ron was good. When he was passionate about something, he put everything into it, and he was enthusiastic about her. It just wasn't enough. It wasn't right. And the problem had more to do with the fact that she didn't want him, but rather something she couldn't identify. More? Harry had been more right than she would have ever admitted to him. But none of that had mattered because he'd seized the opening she'd left for him. What she was missing didn't matter, not when Ron was standing right there, kissing her tirelessly, caressing her gently. He did every little thing she wanted, all the ways she wanted, not out of instinct, but because she'd already told him what to do to make her happy. Told him just how she liked it, and while she tried to focus on the act itself, focus on him, she couldn't blot out the truth that she was wasting her time trying to fill a hole with nothing but air. She was searching for something she couldn't identify in a place she already knew it wasn't, a place it would never be. That had been over 2 years ago, after she told him it could never happen again, and she'd maintained her distance when he hadn't believed her. She'd created better boundaries, organized, categorized, and numbered her rules for why she couldn't do that again, reinforced her walls every time he tried to breach them. And more importantly, Hermione had successfully suppressed that little feeling of something she hadn't been able to identify. It was irrelevant anyway. She had what she needed in her work and friends. Her life was great. She was healthy and content again. And all that feeling had done was make her chase the wind and make poor life decisions. But while Hermione, who was satisfied with her decision to box it all up, moved forward, Ron very much wanted to go back. That was why he stood there, unwavering, like personal space meant nothing between them. "I'm picking colors with Pansy today for my bathroom." Hermione carefully sidestepped him. "You're welcome to come with us." Ron blanched and shook his head as if he'd eaten something foul. "I still don't understand why you're friends with her. She tried to—" "My friendship with her is my own business, but if you must know, we've made our peace with the past. I signed a treaty. Literally. It's done. I've let it go, and so has Harry. If he can move on, how is it your right to cling to the past? They'll never be best mates, but they're at least civil with each other." She thought about the one time Harry and Pansy had yelled at each other for a solid hour on a topic she couldn't recall, while she and Ginny watched with amusement and shared taffy. Well, for the most part. She waved a hand flippantly at the last bit. "Why can't you?" "I really don't want to talk about her. I just want to spend some time with you." Hermione folded her arms across her chest, eyebrow raised when she noted the intimate tone in his voice had taken. "Respect my choice." "I do. I just think you're wrong." "You didn't think that when we broke up. In fact, you looked relieved, if I'm remembering it correctly." And she knew she was. Ron couldn't deny the truth, but that didn't mean he wouldn't argue his point. "Okay, but you were working all hours of the day and night, Hermione. I barely saw you. I wanted you home with me, and when you were, you hardly ever let me touch you because you would complain when I asked you to do anything. You were stressed out all the time, and you pushed me away once I quit the Aura department. You were always going to work functions, and I didn't mind going with you, but we never spent any time together because someone was always there to pull you away. Whenever I complained about it, you were dismissive. Of course I wanted it to end. You were miserable, and so was I." He wasn't wrong. Hermione could admit her own faults, and she had on several occasions, both to him and her therapist. She wasn't perfect, but her imperfections were only a part of the issues. There was an entire other side of their problems that he wouldn't point out because it wasn't like Ron to highlight his own flaws in their failed relationship. "I have several edits to make to your arguments. First edit, I didn't complain when you asked me to do something. You asked me to do everything. I cooked and cleaned after working all day, and you sat there like it was an expectation. I'm not your bloody mother. Second edit, I'm not trying to argue with you, Hermione." He had the gall to sound tired. "You don't want to argue." He was already mobilizing her fleet of responses and her artillery unit for one, ready to pick anything and everything out of the sky with precision and accuracy. "That's interesting when you—" "No." Ron gave a frustrated huff, running a hand over his face. "Okay, maybe I said that wrong. I'm trying to point out that we're different now. When you had your seizure and you quit your job, things changed. Then you went into healing and everything got better. You're better now. I figured out what I wanted to do, and the timing is right. We're older, more mature. We can do this." She peered up at him with her mouth in a tight line. "You don't love me, Ron. Not really." He looked offended. "That's not true." "It is. You say that we can do this, that we're older, that things are better. But not once did you say that you still love me." At that, his blue eyes widened slightly and his cheeks reddened. "It's okay that you don't, Ron. Stop forcing yourself to settle for me when I'm not what you truly want." "Just because I didn't say it doesn't mean I don't feel it." "You're circling around again because you think things will be easier now, but they won't. You think what happened changed me? That was 6 years ago, Ron, and it only changed my career trajectory. It didn't drastically alter who I am." Their personalities didn't work together. She didn't need any more data to prove her point. They had years of evidence that supported her theory of incompatibility. Exhaling her frustration, Hermione rubbed her temple with 2 fingers, then ran her hand over her face and took another deep breath. "I want my best friend back. I want to just leave us in the past where we belong." Ron, as usual, stuck to his beliefs. It was typically an admirable quality.
but now it was just bothersome. You like action more than words. He stepped closer to her. So let me prove it to you. What he didn't understand was that she didn't have to do anything. It wasn't her obligation to give him the opportunity to resurrect their dead relationship simply because it was something he wanted. Something everyone wanted. Expected, even. But it didn't work like that. Hermione didn't owe any of them a thing. I'm leaving now. I'll see you this weekend for planting, if you decide to come. She turned and walked in the direction of the kitchen where Molly stood at the sink, pretending to watch vegetables, when she'd only just heard the water cut on. Molly had heard everything. I'm leaving. I'll see you Saturday. Okay, love. Molly gave her a faint smile, hesitated for a moment, then added, You know, I love you both. I've always thought you two would work things out in your own time. But give him some thought. At the affronted look blossoming on Hermione's face, Molly held up her scarred hand. And if you truly don't love him anymore, don't give him a second chance to show his affections. Let him go so he can move on. But what she didn't understand was that her advice was too late. Hermione already had. March 29th, 2011. When Hermione resolved to do something and committed herself to an idea, she was like a seeker with a snitch in sight. She told Molly she would think about it, and the promise had led her to do just that at sunrise when she took her tea and disappeared into her office with Narcissa's file to review and reflect, both of which turned into a deep dive off a cliff that sent her to a lot of unexpected places. Like her parents' home at 8 a.m. Her mother had been out shopping, and her dad was just getting up when he opened the door for her, a late riser since retirement. When she asked to use the computer they barely ever touched, despite her mom's insistence that they had to have one, he pointed in the direction of the living room and left her to it. For 2 hours, she scoured the internet for research and printed articles on the Muggle counterpart to Narcissa's condition, Lewy body dementia. The idea was to learn more about its history, the protein buildup responsible, the steps in diagnosis, and the progression. Hermione absorbed every detail she could, chronicling and organizing and making small notes to herself on scraps of paper that turned into a notebook when her dad took pity on the overcrowding paper covering her notes and lines that had either been underlined or marked through. He then pulled up a chair next to her and tried to pick his brain. How much do you know about dementia? I'm a retired dentist, he shrugged. I probably know about as much as the average person who has no experience with it. He eyed the stack of papers next to the printer. But what I do know is if you print everything out, we'll likely need more paper. At least the cartridge is new. Your mother insisted on having a printer, but hardly uses it. He shook his head. They both did, because that was typical. Hermione bit on her nails thoughtfully. Can you get more paper, please? It's about a case I promised to have a second look at. Oh? It was rare for him to show interest in her work. I didn't think wizards got dementia. It's not common, but it happens. There's something in the magical core that makes it progress quicker. The one time having magic wasn't beneficial. Her father looked confused as he adjusted the sleeve of his maroon jumper. Magic can't protect us from everything. In the end, we're all human and subject to the same decay. This way is just more rapid. True, but why research the disease if it's not exactly the same? Because it's the closest one there is. And since it's rare in wizards, there's little research out there. The Americans seem to have more cases, but still no cure. There are other books, but getting a working knowledge of something similar may be effective in the long run. This form of dementia in wizards, the symptoms and the nature of the disease are almost identical. It's only the speed of the progression that differs. Her dad was quiet for long enough for Hermione to return to scrolling. You remind me so much of your mum right now. What do you need? When she froze and looked, she found her dad's smile was modest yet indulgent. The exchange had been harmonious and fluid in a way she had sorely missed. It felt nice. They may have had the same eyes and nose and chin all along, but for the first time in a while, she didn't feel like a familiar stranger. No, she actually felt like his daughter. I'll need paper. Her voice was quiet, even though her heart was thundering in her chest. 1 or 2? Caught up in the rush of emotions, Hermione barely heard him. Paper packs, 1 or 2. She cleared her throat. Best make it 2. With a nod, he left her alone. It took a minute, but Hermione refocused on her task,
burying herself in research as she moved from one article to the next, frowning at what she found. The disease was relentless, even in muggles, and receiving a conclusive diagnosis appeared to take just as long. Pansy had mentioned that Narcissa had been seeing healers for a year before her diagnosis, which begged the question, how long had she been experiencing symptoms? There were 7 stages to dementia, but most patients weren't diagnosed until the 4th. Hermione was steadily making notes on the 3rd page in her notebook when a voice interrupted her concentration. "You should eat." It was her dad again, and he was wearing a black jacket, his hair clearly tousled by the wind. He also looked slightly wet? Was it raining? Had he already gone out? One look at the 2 packs of perfectly dry printer paper under his arm answered her question. In the other was takeaway. "That was fast," Hermione said in a wide-eyed bewilderment. "I don't remember hearing you leave." Her dad chuckled with a quick shake of his frizzy head. "I've been gone an hour. Here." He shrugged a little and sat the bag in front of her. It looked like a salad. "It's probably not as organic as you eat from your garden, but—" He awkwardly cleared his throat. "I thought maybe you hadn't eaten." "Thanks, Dad. It's perfect." Outside of whiskey-induced moments while painting, he had never been too expressive. Hermione watched as he loaded the printer with more paper, noting the 2nd container on a nearby table. "If you want, we could eat together." She was barely able to keep the note of hope out of her voice. He declined. "No, go ahead. You're researching. I'm going to listen to the Arsenal commentary on the radio." Because she wasn't ready to sever the tenuous connection between them, Hermione ran her fingers through her hair, then began the careful task of untangling her fingers because she hadn't bothered to brush it that morning after her shower. "So, when's the next game? Or is the season over? I'm not certain." If this was a way in, she would learn it if she had to. Her father looked genuinely surprised by her question. No, not over yet. The next game is on the 2nd against Blackburn Rovers. Doesn't look good, but we'll see. It's not been all bad this season." He glanced over at her screen. "I'll leave you to it. Let me know if you need anything else." Hermione watched until he was out of sight. Maybe it was nothing, but it felt like something. The salad wasn't very good, but the sentiment behind it was enough for Hermione to eat every bite while she kept working. Another hour passed before she joined her dad on the sofa. Donning a pair of reading glasses, he skimmed the paper with the sports commentary playing in the background. When he looked over the rim, he noticed her sitting there patiently waiting. He ruffled the paper. "What is it?" "Do you have a library card?" They ended up at the library, her mystified father looking around. He likely hadn't set foot in there since Hermione was a child. But he followed behind her as she found the right section and started pulling books off the shelf. A natural step in her pursuit of knowledge. "I think there's a limit," he laughed when she struggled to balance 4 volumes in her arms while picking up a 5th. He had 3 in his arms already and looked woefully out of his depth. "I'm quite certain there is." And so there was. Hermione used her dad's card and checked out the maximum number, leaving 3 on the counter with a heavy sigh. They made another quick stop where she bought him a new set of paintbrushes and things. She left from her parents' house with hundreds of printed pages and a stack of books that were due back in 2 weeks. She made a note to drop them off herself. It was enough to keep Hermione busy for the rest of the day, but as soon as she returned home, her attention returned to Narcissa's file, and the healers she had seen prior to her diagnosis. They had to have files on her, too, files that probably had pertinent information. She would need those. Again, just to give Narcissa's case a thorough, fair examination. Then the flu calls started. The first 3 healers didn't answer. Hermione was just about to give up after drafting owls to send later from the owlery at Godric's Hollow when she realized that, while it was just evening there, it was only around lunchtime where the final healer was based in Boston. Charles Smith was a graduate of Ilvermorny, a leading healer in the field of magical neurological conditions. With 20 years of experience with both the muggle and magical variety of this disease, he was her best hope for answers. He was also probably eating lunch, but persistence was her middle name, so she tried her luck again, and was rewarded when the flu finally connected. A voice made the flames dance. "This is Charles Smith." Hermione all but scrambled to sit in front of the fireplace, her notebook ready. "Hi, sorry for the intrusion and abrupt flu call." "It's no problem. I was just finishing up a consult. Your timing is impeccable." "Good to know." Now, down to business. "Perfect. My name is Hermione Granger, and I'm a healer. I was calling because you diagnosed a patient with dementia a few months ago. I'm reviewing their case file after a consultation and have a few questions. More like several, but she didn't want to scare him. There was a long enough silence for her to wonder if the transatlantic connection had failed, but then she heard a clear American accent ask, "And the name of the patient?" "Narcissa Malfoy." Another pause. "Ah, her." That didn't bode well. But considering the person, it made perfect sense. "She's quite difficult." That went without saying. "She subjected herself to my testing methods, which are unconventional at best and involve a battery of non-magical tests that generally make most wizard folk uncomfortable. I think she just wanted answers. However, when I offered to take her on as a patient and work with her palliative care healers, I explained what my care would entail, and she said she didn't agree with my methodology and would find her own healer." Well, that was surprising. "Oh?" Hermione scratched out more notes. "What didn't she agree with?" "She didn't say anything until I mentioned that I work with a no-mag specialist. One would start her on medication and arrange for specialists in London to begin working with her." Hermione put her notebook down. Intriguing. Why a specialist? "I've noticed that a combination of magical and non-magical treatment is best to lengthen the time between phases. When I mentioned my partner and what his care involved, she declined and left my office." "Did she say why?" Hermione popped her knuckles. Her hands were tired from their hard work. "No." Words like prejudice and bigotry came to mind, but Hermione didn't want to judge and sentence Narcissa for a crime she didn't know if she'd actually committed. "I was quite shocked, but she did have an old-school distrust of people without magic that's understandable for patients her age and from her culture. My partner's father is a squib. His sister is a witch, but he was born without magic. He's familiar with wizarding customs, and I tried to explain this to her, but she refused to have anything to do with him or his methodology, and that was that." Hermione nodded with understanding, then stopped as she realized she was on a flu call and shook her head embarrassed. The flames danced on. "Are there any healers in my area that have experience with her disease?" "I don't know of any, but dementia in wizards is beginning to rise there. Narcissa was my third patient from overseas that month. The other two started in my care and are doing well, as can be expected." That was good to hear. The wizard chuckled to himself, making the flames flare slightly. "It's funny you were calling. The owner of St. Mungo's reached out to me and asked me the same questions." She perked up again. She liked the fact that Charles was chatty. "I advised him to pick someone who had a background in slowing down the illness to treat her. Someone with tough skin, willing to learn a lot very quickly, and able to treat the situation with a dynamic approach and the delicacy it requires. It's not a matter of speciality. It's a matter of patience and understanding." Well, that explained a lot. "Is there a way to incorporate Muggle methods into treating her without a specialist?" "While there's no cure, nor any potions or medications aimed specifically at treating the disease, we focus our treatment on alleviating the symptoms. The Muggle specialist tends to handle the medication aspect of treatment. They focus on therapies, such as physical and speech. Lifestyle changes could be key, too. The same healthy lifestyle changes that are used to prevent dementia in Muggles can also be used in slowing the advancement of symptoms in witches and wizards." "Such as?" "Regular exercise, sleep, mitigating stress, mental stimulation, and keeping up social engagements. She has a healthy social life from what I remember, so I would monitor this to make certain she is not wearing herself out. Also a brain-healthy diet. The healer who cares for her would need to tackle her motor control deterioration and the depression that will likely come as an issue as she progresses. Lastly, making sure her family is on board and connected is key, but as a healer you know this. In her case, her family needs a plan to ensure her safety as her memories and body deteriorate. From what I understand, she is responsible for her grandson in some capacity." That was true. "Remember, she still has magic and accidents can happen. Accidental bursts of magic are common during the later stages, but apparition during a moment of confusion is highly dangerous. Splinching is common and can be fatal." Duly noted. Hermione underlined that note twice. "I'm assuming the magical aspect of treatment involves potions." "Yes, but it's tricky. I've read she's on a 5-potion regimen, but I'm not certain if it's working." Judging by what Hermione had seen during their brief meeting, it almost certainly was not. "I personally use a 9-potion system for my patients. The more specifically targeted the composition of the potion is as it pertains to her metabolic response, the better and more consistently it'll work." And then he listed all 9 without her having to ask. Hermione scribbled down each.
We're working to develop a potion to encompass them all into one that perhaps will marginally slow the progression of the disease, but we're still sorting the composition and the bureaucracy." She shook her head, knowing a little about how politicians dip their toes into things that they had no business in. "Good luck with that, and thank you. If needed, would you be available for future consults? For other patients, of course, not Narcissa Malfoy." Hermione had always been committed to the continued sharing of knowledge, a lifelong student, and Charles seemed like a good ally to have. "I have a Magi scheduler. Just schedule something when I'm free. You can add me. My middle name is Alexander. There are more Charles Smiths than I can account for." "I'm probably the only Hermione Granger, so I'll be easy to add." They both chuckled, and she looked at the time, noticing that almost 15 minutes had passed. "Thank you. I have a lot to review. Apologies again for disturbing you." "None needed. Good luck treating Mrs. Malfoy." "Oh, I'm not treating her. I'm just doing a bit of research." Before ending the flu call, she swore she heard a very confused, "Wait, what?" from the other end. Hermione got up, stretched, and went to pour herself more tea. Black tea with a splash of milk. She was beginning the process of sorting through her findings when she thought about one last call she needed to make. A flu call to Mrs. Malfoy's primary healer, who had prescribed the current regimen of potions Narcissa was taking. "Kendrick." The wizard who answered sounded extremely put out. "Hello, my name is Hermione Granger." "Oh!" With some degree of annoyance, she heard him sputter and noted his abrupt change in tone. "Healer Granger, how can I be of assistance?" "Apologies for the late call." "No, not at all. It's not every day one receives a call from the Hermione Granger. It's an honor." Hermione opened her mouth, but remembered she was looking for information, which was going to be an easier mission now that he wanted to impress her. "Thank you. I was just reaching out to discuss a patient of yours, Narcissa Malfoy. She was referred to me after being diagnosed with—" "Ah, yes. Nasty bit of business." "Truly unfortunate." Hermione paused. "How much do you know about her condition?" He obviously hadn't expected her call or line of questioning, so she waited patiently while he found her chart. A chart Hermione requested a copy of. For review, of course. "Admittedly, I don't know much about her condition. I'm more of a general healer. I prescribed her with potions based on what I felt would work best. The healer who diagnosed her prescribed 9 potions, which I thought to be excessive." "And how did you pick the 5? "Her disease is incurable. When she sought my care, she was taking 7 of the 9 that had been prescribed. I picked the 5 with the most benefits and the least amount of side effects so that she could continue on as a normal for as long as possible. It was her request." "And you let the patients decide their own treatment?" There was silence, and Hermione realized just how snippy her question had sounded. Before he could respond, she cleared her throat. "Does she have a personal potions master creating these potions especially for her?" "No." Kendrick sounded like he was trying to figure out how he should feel. "She acquires them from the apothecary herself." "Did you consider her body chemistry when picking the potions?" "No." That was to be expected from someone with only a passing amount of knowledge on the topic. No matter. The more questions Hermione asked, the more she appeared to irritate him. She didn't know why. Knowing the quantity and quality of ingredients in each prescribed potion was a vital aspect of the art of healing. When she reminded him of this, well, apparently the fire call disconnected. What a pity. But she could find out for herself. Even without magic, dementia is a strange mind game, Hermione thought as she scoured all the research she had gathered that day. She realized, as she reread the book that she had taken from Theo's office on magic's effects on neurological disease, that it seemed like magic itself fueled the disease, making it more unpredictable and aggressive. Full of uncertainty, which Hermione didn't like. She could keep every variable the same, do everything right, and Narcissa could still die in 3 years. Or she could live 6, 10. Well, that was unheard of, according to the book. The point was that there were no guarantees, no way to control the outcome or timing of, well, anything, and that didn't make her comfortable. But she had to remember that Narcissa wasn't asking for a cure. She was asking for time. It wasn't something she couldn't guarantee or even promise. All she could do was try. But would that be good enough? Well, Hermione frowned at the thought, if she were accepting her as a patient, which she was not. Too full of nervous energy to sit, Hermione drifted around her office, reading and organizing her printed research into 3 piles: relevant, irrelevant, and unknown. She was more than a quarter of the way through when she realized that the sun was no longer in the sky.
Then she noticed the haphazard state of the rest of her office. Well, someone knocked on her door 3 times. Only Pansy. She hadn't even felt the wards tingle in response to her arrival. Interesting. Hermione had half a mind to clear away the papers, but it was too late. Pansy threw open the door. "Granger, you have been in here for—" The witch took one look around the state of her office and gasped. "Are you cracked?" "I'm doing a bit of research," Hermione sighed as Pansy gesticulated wildly around her office. "Okay, a lot of research. This is your fault, mind you." Her voice went up an entire octave. "What the—" "Ugh!" Before the witch started shrilling, she cut her off. "You're the one who wanted me to consider Narcissa." "Well, yes, I did, but—" Pansy narrowed her eyes. "How long have you been in here?" "It was daylight when I last looked up." "Have you eaten?" "My dad brought me a salad." Pansy looked murderous, which was normal. "You went to your parents'?" "And the library." She gestured to the books under her keep pile. "I made a few flu calls, too. One to the American healer who diagnosed Narcissa." Her friend's patience was clearly wearing incredibly thin. "Okay, let me rephrase this. When was the last time you ate something?" Folding her arms defiantly, she repeated herself. "I had a salad." "Fucking hell! I'm calling Weasley!" Pansy turned on her heel and left. Hermione swore violently, nearly tripping over a pile of papers which she tried to catch up. She called after Pansy, but the witch only covered her ears and made some squawking noise that Luna would have been proud of as she marched into the living room. The last person on Earth Hermione wanted summoned to talk about her eating habits was Ginny Potter. She had 3 kids, and there would be hell to pay if she had to show up to take care of her. Not to mention the disappointed looks that mastered since becoming a parent. The last time Ginny had worried about her, there had been many memorable threats about calling her therapist. And worse, her mother. No thanks. There was only one motion, one move that she could use, her best move. She knew better than to bargain with a Slytherin, but desperate times called for desperate measures. "Dinner! Wherever you want!" Everything, both Pansy and her obnoxious noises, stopped. She whirled around. Her voice was as smooth as her smirk on her face. "I believe we have a deal." March 30th, 2011. Roger Davies was a brilliant healer. His older brother had landed in the Janus Thicky ward after he'd tried to obliviate himself on the 1-year anniversary of the day that his muggle-born wife had been killed by snatchers. Because of his brother, and everything his family had endured in the aftermath, maintaining quality mental health was Roger's personal mission. After all, his brother hadn't been alone in his struggles after the war. There were countless cases of traumatized Aurors having flashbacks during missions and training exercises. Potions and substance abuse statistics were high as well, and the sharp increase of instances concerning incorrectly applied memory charms resulted in a surplus of patients in the Janus Thicky ward. On a random Tuesday in October, after endless petitions on his part, the Wizengamot had allowed Roger to present his proposal for funding to create an alternative health department at St. Mungo's. The department would research and treat patients whose ailments were primarily mental and didn't fit in any other department. Fresh out of her makeup year at Hogwarts and working in the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures, Hermione hadn't had time to attend the hearing, but she had heard that, while the talk was certainly illuminating, his proposal had been rejected almost unanimously. The minister had been the only approval, but his word was no longer the law. Roger's failure was worth mentioning because of what happened next. Roughly 6 months after the rejection, Pravati Patil had published an article in the Daily Prophet about her difficulties with survivor's guilt following the death of her best friend. She talked about how she wished the ministry would help those who were still struggling, not with the financial assistance that had helped their economy recover, but actual help. Someone who could help them navigate the new normal in their community. Someone who knew about their struggles that they could talk to. A companion piece, published the following day, had photos provided by Dennis Creevy, who'd paid tribute to his fallen brother by using Colin's camera to tell the story of his family's struggles adjusting to life without him. Together, the 2 articles had resonated so strongly with everyone who had lost someone during the war that the public actually started talking about their problems rather than burying them. In fact, the response had been so powerful that when Roger returned, the Wizengamot was forced to approve his proposal or risk the wrath of already waning public opinion. But in Roger's eyes, the journey didn't matter, only that he'd won the race. His research on PTSD's effect on magic had ended up being groundbreaking. The articles published in papers all around the wizarding world. Precedents had been set. Mental health was no longer a taboo, but a topic people sought help for. Even before Hermione's abrupt change in careers, she'd read each and every one of his papers on the effects of trauma and stress on magic as she tried to sort through her own issues. It should have prepared her for what had happened to her, but hindsight was always perfect, as the saying went. Regardless, Hermione held the wizard in high regard, and respected him as a fellow healer and innovator. But there was just one thing. Well, actually, there was more than one thing, but first things first. She could never trust anyone with a spotless office. Hermione considered herself a tidy person, but she preferred a certain method to all the madness in her world. She preferred just enough clutter in life to make things interesting without becoming across as, well, cluttered. Besides, with all the research that went along with their work, there were always bound to be something lying around. But Roger and his office looked like they were being featured in Witch Weekly, and with his popularity, for all she knew, that very well could have been true. For just a breath, Hermione, who wore coveralls that had seen better days, a white shirt, and trainers with anti-slip charms, felt underdressed. But then she remembered the purpose of her visit, and she wasn't there to impress anyone. Hermione knocked on his open door twice, trying not to look too judgmental when he lifted his head from his work and waved her into his pristine office with a genial smile on his face. Roger was handsome in a clinical sense, with his short brown hair that was neatly combed, brown eyes, and medium build. He gave all appearances of the successful person he was. "Punctual as always. Please come in." After doing just that, she shut the door behind her. "Afternoon, Roger." When she slid into the chair in front of his desk, Hermione peeked at the file on his. Not a patient's file, but research. His latest project involved experimental treatment for the extremely traumatized patients that resided full-time in their ward. From what Padma had told her, the trials weren't going well. "How are you?" Roger greeted her with a friendly smile, and she returned. Even though their individual war stories had made them both famous, they were little more than colleagues with a healthy mutual respect for each other's work. "I was quite surprised when your name appeared on my calendar for a meeting. I thought you were between patients." Everyone was well aware that when that occurred, she barely made an appearance at the hospital, for anything except meetings with Theo. In lieu of a proper response to his greeting, where she would be forced to make small talk on topics she didn't mean to, Hermione bypassed his question and comment. "I was wondering if you'd started working on Narcissa Malfoy's case." "I have not." Roger offered her his full attention by leaning forward and resting his elbows on his oak desk. "I did, however, review her contract. We're scheduled to meet to discuss my terms tomorrow." Without looking at her case, Hermione kept her tone even, unbothered. Roger had never been modest, always bordering on conceited, but it wasn't his job to downplay his talent and success. Healers, as a whole, were an arrogant bunch, so it had never mattered much to her. How could patients trust a healer if they weren't confident in their abilities? "I have reviewed her file, but I have also 4 other priority cases ahead of hers. If I'm being honest, I only accepted Mrs. Malfoy because of your reference and, well, curiosity. I've never seen a case like hers. I'm interested in the possibility of running tests to determine if her condition is genetic or environmental." Tests were all well and good, but Narcissa's disease was in the early stages. The quicker they attacked it, the better chance they had to slow its progress. At least, that was what her research had suggested. Which led to something else that bothered her about him. At heart, Roger was a researcher. He was meticulous, with an eye for detail, and knew how to back up an argument. Hermione was like-minded and had found it easy to work with him when she'd first joined the department about 6 years ago. Where they differed vastly, however, was their bedside manner. Roger looked at his patients, not as individuals, but predominantly in terms of how they might usefully contribute to his future research. Of course, he would work tirelessly while the patient was in his care, and had a record of successes to back up his method, but at the end of it all, they were walking, talking, and breathing case studies. Roger tended to work with only high-profile cases, people who'd experienced extreme trauma, or those who had severe psychosis and were dangerous to be in public. His work as of late had been developing an elixir used to combat PTSD with several potion makers, but he had a growing interest in cases like Narcissa's, where muggle disorders were exacerbated by magic. It had been the reason Hermione had referred the case to him to start with.
Have you created a treatment plan? An outline of one. I want to run more tests to try to determine the cause. That was perfectly fine, but... And when do you plan to start treating her? Roger stroked his chin for a moment, deep in thought. A few months of research will do. Then we can begin experimental treatment options. His words made her want to recoil, but she recovered, suppressing her confusion and flabbergasted look. Aggressive options, right? I'll experiment with some known potions right now. She gave a hard exhale, trying to disguise her frustration. What combination will you use? I haven't thought about it. That made what little patience Hermione possessed slip away. She squinted at him. If you don't mind me asking, what exactly have you thought about? Her tone gave every indication that she was done skirting the issue at hand. She wanted an answer, sooner rather than later. The abrupt question made him falter. Then he cocked his head a bit to the side, fixing her with a hard look. Right then, Hermione realized she'd gone too far. This feels like an interrogation. Sorry, that wasn't my intention. It most certainly was, but she knew when to stand her ground and when a tactful backtrack made the most sense. Right then, the latter was quickly determined to be her best option, one that didn't ruin a perfectly good professional relationship. I've spent a bit of time researching her condition and wanted to have a meeting of minds, but I didn't know you hadn't started. My apologies. She gave a soft, self-deprecating laugh and rubbed the back of her neck with one hand, trying to appear awkward. You know how I am. Insatiable thirst for knowledge. She was reaching, but falling back on history always worked with schoolmates like Roger, and she watched the stern look on his face soften. Then he smiled, shaking his head, and chuckled. I do know how you are. I remember seeing you in the library all the time. I still believe you would have done well in Ravenclaw. Everyone believes that, but she'd been sorted into Gryffindor and had no regrets. As a Ravenclaw, I probably would have still lost a lot of sleep trying to keep Harry alive, but gained us a lot of house points. He flashed her a charming grin. Hermione gave a nostalgic sigh. The things I did for a Gryffindor tapestry. Roger laughed harder while she chuckled along for nothing more than the noise it provided in the silence of his office. Camaraderie. Her misstep was forgiven. She wouldn't let her impatience cause another outburst. Now, for a different angle. Roger loved to pick her brain when he got stuck or something didn't work. Hermione only gave little clues to satisfy him, and she never gave them for free. When I came in, I saw that you were reviewing your research on the new experimental treatment regimen for the extreme cases of emotional trauma. He didn't bother asking how she'd seen all that so quickly. Yes, the trials aren't going well. I heard, Hermione frowned, briefly lamenting with him, and I might have a few thoughts about it. Roger looked intrigued. Go on. I believe your failure was due, in part, to the addition of the Draught of Peace. Long-term use of it causes blunted reactions. Have you considered the Elixir of Tranquility? It's stronger, but not habit-forming, or dangerous if brewed incorrectly. Maybe worth looking into. With his face lit up, Hermione knew she had piqued his interest. I'll do just that. You truly are brilliant, Hermione. I know you have your patients and interests, but if you ever want to collaborate or even join the research side... He allowed the suggestion to linger. I'll think about it. Hermione lied smoothly, then circled back to the reason she'd scheduled this meeting in the first place. Narcissa. In all honesty, I'll take my appreciation in a favor. He made a gesture. Go on. Move Narcissa's case up on your list. I only suggest it as her condition hasn't progressed too much. The faster you start, the more you can work with her from diagnosis and beyond, accounting for every factor conceivable along the way. He looked at her for a moment, then conceded with a nod. I can do that. If you're interested, I've done a bit of research on Narcissa's case, just to give you a head start, of course. You're a busy healer, after all. Flattery never hurt, judging from how quickly he agreed to listen to her. Hermione reached into her bag, pulled out a thick roll of parchment, and sat it on his overly neat desk. A bit of research. Clearly Roger was amused. It's just a brief synopsis of all the research I've compiled on both the Muggle and magical versions of her disease. Because of the summary he was currently skimming, her desk was a bit of a mess, parchment and paper and every bit of research that she'd found on Narcissa's condition. After sushi and sake in London, followed by a film Pansy wanted to see, Hermione had returned home the night before and decided to schedule a short appointment with Roger, just for some follow-up questions. After all, he had to have done just as much research as she had, right? The answer, she now knew, was no. Hermione had doubts, and they all started with the state of his office, and the man himself who sat behind the desk with only his nameplate, a glass of water, his research file, and a picture of his family facing toward him. She'd done enough digging to know that the time Narcissa wanted wouldn't be possible if he treated her like an experiment. No matter what he promised, she still didn't feel right leaving Narcissa in his care. Her decision, she realized while she watched his eyes scan the parchment, was made. "If you'll excuse me, Roger, I have to go. Oh, and I'm going to need that back." Before she could talk herself out of what she could potentially be a poor decision, Hermione took her parchment and left with one destination in mind. She didn't stop until she stood outside Theo's door. In an uncharacteristic move, she knocked and didn't wait for someone to open the door before she walked in, and froze at the sight. The man himself was sitting on the sofa in front of the fireplace, his arm thrown over the back. Nothing looked unusual, except for the child sitting next to him, flipping through the children's dictionary while he looked on. There was a softness in Theo's eyes and a fond expression on his face, one she had never seen from him. It was bizarrely warm and intensely attractive, but she didn't have time to sort through that because standing in front of the mantel was her target, Narcissa. And she appeared deep in thought, standing stiff in gray robes and touching the gold band on her necklace. Hermione cleared her throat and 3 heads snapped to her. Sheepishly, she rubbed the side of her neck. "My apologies for the intrusion. I was coming to talk to Theo about your case, but since you're here, I'd like to discuss the terms of your contract, Mrs. Malfoy." The smallest head in the room tilted to the side in innocent curiosity, eyebrows knitted together as if he were patiently awaiting for her to finish her statement. It was strangely adult, even more so because Theo had a similar look on his face. "Or I could make an appointment if you need to not speak of these matters around him." She awkwardly gestured to the boy wearing black trousers and a black shirt, his platinum blonde hair parted severely to the side. "My grandson is 5. Narcissa's face remained impassive. "He does not understand. Scorpius?" The boy immediately abandoned the dictionary and stood, obedient even without instruction. "Trained." Hermione's frown deepened when she noted the matching expression on Theo's face. Before she could give instructions to her grandson, Theo rose to his feet. "We'll take a walk around the floor while you two speak." He offered the child his hand, but with a look that reminded Hermione very much of his father. Scorpius lowered his eyes to Theo's hand, then back up to the tall wizard who seemed to be imploring him to accept it. "Your manners." Narcissa's voice was nurturing and lecturing all at once, an odd blend. Despite his reluctance, Scorpius complied, placing his hand into Theo's much larger one and allowing himself to be led away. Hermione stepped to the side when they approached, her attention so focused on Narcissa that she barely noticed when they left. When the door shut behind the pair, Narcissa didn't wait. Hermione hadn't expected her to. "I believe you have already refused me. I have a meeting with Healer—" "Cancel it. I've decided to accept your case." "Why?" The question she didn't expect was the first one that Narcissa asked. But Hermione was prepared with an answer. She had several, in fact, but she hadn't known which to provide until the words were already spoken. "I've got a soft spot for helping those in need." "I am no charity case, Miss Granger." "No, you're not." Hermione decided to approach her from a different angle, one that put them both on the common ground that they would need going forward. "You once saved us all, and while I can't return the favor, nor do I offer any guarantees, if you let me, I can try to give you what you've requested." Narcissa stiffened. "And what is that, Miss Granger?" "A fighting chance." "We rise by lifting others." Robert Ingersoll.